Part 32. Then Track's face appeared, and I moaned. Rock and Jackson finally climbed off me slowly, ready to slam me again if needed. I stood up and shook myself, glaring at Rock, who was the closest. He shrugged and blew me a silent kiss. Normally that would make me laugh and break the tension, but my lip curled and I turned away. Now where was that T-top that touched my Track? Elisa was sitting on the couch now, and Rock and Jackson were standing in front of her, with the beanbag chair in front of them. My brows lifted. Were they protecting her? A deep growl started in my chest, and I began to kneel into a crouch. Missy headed towards me, and Track shot her a hard look that stopped her. He reached down, grabbed my arm, and stood me up. Okay, now I was really getting ticked. Were they taking her side? Protecting her from me? That infuriated me, and I was no longer thinking. "We'll be right back," he stated, and walked me out of the room, pulling his phone out as we went, then pushed a button and put it to his ear. When the person on the other side answered, he growled, "Houston, we have a problem." "Tattletale," I snapped, but he ignored me. He walked over to Michael and pushed me towards him. "Don't let her back in there," he stated, then walked off a few paces, still talking in his phone. I slammed my arms over my chest and glanced up at Michael. He shook his head at me, and I turned, glaring at the door. Track's arms were flying as he talked, but he kept his voice quiet. Finally he turned, walked over, and thrust the phone at me. I glared at him and snatched it. "Hello?" I grumbled. Sure enough, it was Phil on the other end. "Stand down, Reina," came the tight voice. Dang, there went that invisible tail between my legs. I sighed and looked at the floor. Track was going to pay for this. "I know this is hard for you," came my click alpha's voice. "You're just coming into your wolf, and with all the other things added, this is creating havoc. But you represent this pack, Reina. I want you to keep that in mind." I heard strange sounds and other muffled voices in the background. Great, he was on his way. Not bad enough to collar me over the phone, he was coming to do it in person. "Reina?" "Yes," I said in a low voice, my jaw twitching. "She is not a wolf." Duh, I thought, but I only sighed. "She's an arrogant T-top that has no idea what she's doing to your wolf side." "Like hell she doesn't," I whispered, and Phil let out a low growl. Okay, my invisible tail couldn't get any lower now. Had he been in front of me, I probably would have been rolled over on the rug. "Look, you've been through a lot. Most wolves grow up with the pack and have a lot of training. We never gave you that because, well, mostly because hybrids don't shift. That's my fault. Now your wolf side is becoming more dominant, or so it seems. Either that, either that cousin of yours is setting it off, or she's just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Great. Now Phil was taking her side. Poor Elisa. Right. Track stepped closer to me and my lip curled. I growled, still looking at the floor. "Knock it off, Reina." Phil's voice snapped. He half covered the phone and said something to someone else. Then he moved it away. "Track is dominant over you, so watch yourself. You test that, and you will be sorry." Yeah, tell me something I don't know. I had seen what happened to a wolf that tried to jump rank. A nasty fight, for starters. Either the wolf succeeded and was up in the pecking order, or he was lucky to limp away. If he lost, he got it from the pack for a very long time. It was not something you did without a lot of thought. "If you pull any stunts, I'm going to have to pull more rank than I want to, and talk to your dad." Ouch. That was a sucker punch I didn't expect, but it worked. My head was bowed low and my anger was draining. I'm sorry to have to say that, but you're my pack and my responsibility. If anything happens to you, or if you do anything, either way, it's my fault. Nice one. A good threat with a sight of guilt. I'm sorry, I whispered, and the anger eased out of his voice. A large part of this isn't your fault, Reina, but you're strong and too smart to let this get the best of you. He chuckled. Look at what you've accomplished. What hybrid has been able to complete a shift, let alone get control over them? I sighed and nodded, even though he couldn't see me. You don't have to come. My voice was low, soft, and submissive now. He was good at his job. Too late, sweetheart, he said in a really bad gangster type accent. Make sure the gate is open for us. Now give Track the phone and be good. Please. I nodded again and held out the phone, not looking at Track. Instead, I looked at Michael and Martin. I shook my head, and Michael smiled. I drew in a long, slow breath and chewed my lower lip until Track hung up the phone. So, are we going back in, or do you need to walk it off? Track asked in a low but firm voice. I'm good, I stated. There were a lot of other things I would have rather said to him, but my Alpha's reprimand had me a little docile at the moment. I wondered if he had to take a class before he got to be Alpha. As we walked in, I played with the idea in my mind. Ryan and the elders up in front of a chalkboard, and Phil on the other, and other Alpha cliques sitting at desks taking notes. I chuckled to myself, and Missy hurried over to me. I leaned into her ear and whispered. She nodded, lowering her head as well. Great. 2 docile female wolves and 1 very non-docile female vampire. This should be interesting. Chapter 20. Track's phone rang again. He looked at it and then closed it. He looked at me. It's for you. I took it, still not able to get the sarcastic remarks out of my head through my lips. Hello, I said quietly. Reina? It was Jonathan. Yes, I replied quietly. Everything okay? I turned and walked off. Why do you keep calling Track's phone? I said, though I couldn't even muster the smallest amount of annoyance, and I swear it sounded like I whimpered. He chuckled. Well, I keep trying your phone first. Let me guess. You set it down somewhere and can't remember where that was. Oh, I think I left it at the pool, I stated quietly. What's wrong? He asked, his voice worried. Nothing. Well, Phil is on his way, I sighed. Gotta love the effect your Alpha has over you. It makes you compliant in too many ways. Phil? What happened? There was an urgency in his voice, and I shrugged. Better let Track explain. I held out the phone, and he took it, then walked into the hallway, leaving the door open. Missy looked at me, her eyes reaching out and offering support. I gave her a sincere but small smile, my head still lowered. I wondered how long the effects of Phil's talk lasted. Elisa walked over to me, and Missy was instantly at my side. Is everything okay? My cousin asked, grinning at me. Great. She knew. Somehow she knew. That was mortifying all by itself. Everything is fine, I whispered, and she gave a very quiet chuckle that only Missy and I heard. Missy took my hand. Come on, let's sit and watch a movie. I followed her to the couch and we sat. Miles took the spot next to her, and Rock sat on the other side of me. Elisa looked at the chairs and then smiled and sat on the beanbag. She turned to Jackson and patted the spot next to her. You want to sit here? Jackson frowned and walked to one of the chairs. I'm good, thanks, he stated, and then looked at me. Great. They all knew. The guys and Missy could tell by my body language that I had just been put in my place. But how did Elisa know? She was pure vampire, and from what she said, Hadn't spent any time with wolves. Track walked back in, looked around, and went and put the movie in. He grabbed the remote and took the other empty chair. Elisa flipped her white hair and crossed her legs, leaning back so that her chest showed more. I rolled my eyes, but sat silently. 15 minutes later, Phil and Marcus walked in the room. Down went my head, and out went the rest of my anger. Great. I couldn't snap now if I wanted to. Elisa was up faster than Track, and she was smiling at the newcomers. Track walked past her and over to the two. They talked quietly, and Phil shot me a look. I didn't see it. My head was down, but I felt it. "Who are your friends, Track?" Elisa sang, and Track quickly introduced them. She held out her hand. "Well, hello. I'm Elisa Michaels, Reina's cousin." I watched them shake her hand quickly from the corner of my eye. A small twinge of anger tried to spark. She was not only touching my pack brothers, she was touching my alpha. My hackles tried to spike, but they couldn't. Yeah, Phil was good. I glanced up and saw Phil give Miles a look. He shot up out of his chair, and Missy followed. Great. Take away my only ally. Missy came over, and I stood. She gave me a hard hug and whispered in my ear, "I'm only a phone call away, no matter what." I smiled at her. Missy gave me a hug, and they turned to leave. "Oh, you don't have to leave so soon, do you?" Elisa whined, moving so she was standing next to Marcus. He kept his eyes straight ahead and his hands folded in front of him. "The movie was just starting." She turned to Marcus. "Tell them to stay," she whined. Marcus's brows narrowed, but Miles shook his head. "Thanks, but we need to be getting back." Then Elisa walked over quickly and hugged Missy. My brows rose and Missy's body stiffened. Elisa smiled at her. "It was so nice to meet you. I hope you'll both sit with me and my friends at the party." Then she turned to Miles, and Track interceded quickly. "Hey, Miles, do you know that bonfire that we—" His voice trailed off as they walked out of the room, Missy turning back and giving me a sympathetic wave. I waved back, and then she was gone. I sighed and sat back down on the couch. "A bonfire," Elisa yelped. "Oh, that sounds like fun." I leaned back and saw Phil's brows lift. When he didn't respond, she turned to Marcus. "Is it for wolves only? Or are vampires invited as well?" I watched her turn her shoulders a little, and I tilted my head. Phil's jaw tensed. "It's for a pack meeting," he stated, and Alyssa's shoulders sagged. But a second later she turned. "Well, are we going to watch the movie?" Track came back in, and I leaned on Jackson's shoulder. "Is this ever going to end?" I whispered, and he chuckled. Rock headed towards the refrigerator, and I knew there wasn't enough food in there for anyone. "I can go to the kitchen and get some food," I said, standing. I needed to get out of here, even for a few minutes. "I'll go with you and help," Track said. Then we both looked at Phil out of instinct and habit. Unfortunately, Elisa noticed. Phil gave a soft nod, and we both left. I heard Alyssa's voice as Track closed the door. "Are you her alpha?" Track shot me a look, and I lowered my head. While we were making sandwiches and putting them on a platter, Jonathan walked in. I smiled at him, and he looked at the platter. "Planning a party?" he chuckled. "Phil, Marcus, Rock, Jackson, and Track," I stated. Miles and Missy were here too, but they had to leave, I added, my head dipping a little. Jonathan looked at Track and then smiled at me, holding out my phone. "You were right. It was in the changing room." "Oh, thanks," I stated, and crammed it into my back pocket. Jonathan went to the refrigerator and pulled out a 6-pack of pop. Then Track picked up the platter, and we all headed back. "So, how was Beamer's?" I asked, not really caring, but the silence was a bit unnerving. "Good," he stated. "Everything's a little ahead of schedule, actually. Aunt Mary wanted to change a few things, but I finally talked her out of pink and white streamers. I flinched and he laughed. She said I needed to make it more feminine. Gads, I whispered, and he chuckled again. So, everything under control? I shrugged. Phil's here. I've been effectively cowed. I didn't mean for it to come out that way. Track looked at me and I shrugged. Everything's fine. Just peachy, I whispered the last part. When we walked back into the room, Elisa turned. She was standing next to Marcus and Phil talking. I looked at the TV screen, which was still on pause. We wanted to wait for you, she smiled and rushed over to take the platter from Track. He let her. She looked down at the sandwiches with curiosity. Then she sat them on the small table and turned. Well, boys, come and get it, she announced, standing directly in front of the table. Jonathan walked over and sat the pop down. She grinned at him. So how's Beamer's? Good, he stated. I've never been there, she replied, following him for a few steps. The guys took advantage of her moving and went for the table. Well then, I hope you enjoy it at the party, Jonathan stated, walking towards me. I was standing next to Phil and Marcus now, and I had no idea what to do. Whatever had reared its ugly head was just still under the surface. But Phil's dominance over me was stronger at the moment, and I was standing a bit in front of him and was very quiet. Jonathan and Phil exchanged a quick glance, and then Jonathan took my hand. He walked me over to one of the recliners, and we both sat in it. There was plenty of room, but I sat with my hands in my lap and my eyes down. Jonathan looked over at me, then reached over and held my hand. I missed you, he whispered in my ear. I smiled. I missed you too. I figured it wasn't being clingy to say that, since he said it first. Trent walked in then and looked around the room. Elisa ran over, grabbed Marcus and Phil's hands, and dragged them over to her brother to be introduced. My whole body stiffened. I felt my hair stand on end, and this time it succeeded. Phil and Marcus let go of her hand, and Trent frowned. You'll have to excuse my sister. She hasn't a clue when it comes to anybody who isn't a vampire and runs in her crowd. Elisa huffed. What's that supposed to mean, Trent? I'm just being a good hostess and introducing everyone. I stood up then, faster than Jonathan could stop me. That was a call-out. She was flat out claiming my territory now. I felt the growl in my throat, and I eyed her hard, daring her to turn around and face me. Phil shook his head without turning around. That silenced the growl, but I remained standing. Then Aunt Mary walked in. She eyed everyone and then smiled at me and Jonathan. She let Elisa introduce her to the two new wolves, and true to form, Aunt Mary embraced them and told them they must come visit her. That did make me smile. A little. Phil looked a bit thrown, and a small part of me took pleasure in that. She walked over to us and hugged me hard. Oh dear, that party is going to be marvelous. She threw her hands up to emphasize it, and then I did smile, all the way. You just couldn't be mad with her around. Elisa giggled behind her, and Aunt Mary smiled at me. I shook off the anger, and she tapped her chin. Jonathan, do you mind if I borrow Reina just for a few minutes? I frowned, but he looked at me. She laughed. Oh, I promise it won't be more than a few minutes. I want to show her something, and I'm afraid it just can't wait. With that, she reached out, took my hand, and started to pull me towards the door. I turned and looked at Jonathan, who was frowning now. Then I looked at Phil, who shrugged. I mumbled and followed her out. Great. Now Elisa had them all to herself. Aunt Mary looked up at Michael. My, you're a big fellow, aren't you? She patted his chest, and I chuckled as his eyes widened. Then she turned me down the hall and chatted away about the party until we got to my room. We'll be just a moment, she said to Michael, and then shut the door. When she turned, she shook her head. My dear, if you want to beat that little hussy, you must learn to play the game. My eyes widened and my mouth fell open. She nodded and then walked me over and sat me on the bench at my dressing table. I was sure my mouth was still open, but I couldn't bring myself to close it. Now then, she stated, walking in front of me, your first error, and it's not your fault. Not in the least, she added, smiling at me, is thinking like a wolf. She chuckled. Not that it won't come in handy, but Elisa is not a wolf. She isn't playing by wolf rules. You must use your vampire side for this. She looked up at the ceiling and thought, and I glanced up at it, thinking maybe somehow something was up there. She has obviously found your buttons and she is pushing them and playing you like a flute, sweetie. I blinked rapidly. Was this really happening? I sat and listened. Aunt Mary walked back and forth, spitting out information and forming a game plan like a professional sports coach. She used her hands a lot when she talked, but she made sense. When she finally stopped, she reached out and pulled me to my feet. She put one hand on each of my shoulders and looked at me hard. Well, with a twinkle in her eye. Now, dear, do you understand that little whippet a bit more? I nodded. Oh, you bet I did. I smiled and hugged her first this time. She laughed and rocked me back and forth. Oh, dear, you poor thing. You really need a woman to help you with this sort of thing. She pulled me to arm's length. You really have to come and visit me soon. I laughed and nodded again. When we walked out of my room, she turned. Well, I'm off. So many things to do, dear. You have fun with your little friends. She waved over her head, and I looked up at Michael, wondering how much he might have heard. He was holding back a smile, and I grinned. Then I turned and headed towards my sitting room, feeling better than I had all day. When I reached the room, the double doors were wide open. I winked at Michael and walked in. Phil was closest to the door, with Marcus just on the other side of him. He stepped in front of me and gave me a look. Dang, there went that tail. But I smiled. I'm good now. He looked me over and I chuckled. Aunt Mary could teach you guys a thing or two. About a lot of things. I was smiling my normal smile now, and he shook his head but grinned back at me. Marcus smiled too, and I turned and looked around the room. Jonathan was standing to the side, talking with Trent and Track. Jackson and Rock were standing up from the beanbag chair, and Elisa was heading my way. I smiled and turned, standing in front of Phil. He cleared his throat, and I moved to his side. Sorry, I whispered. Standing in front of him was a defense stance. We're so glad you were able to escape so quickly, she chuckled and shrugged. And I shrugged. Actually, Jonathan's aunt is great. I like her a lot. Elisa laughed. You don't have to pretend here. I don't think she can hear you. She whispered the last part, and I winked. I'm not pretending. I smiled back, and she balked. There was a long silence. She looked at my chest. Oh, what a pretty little necklace, she stated, leaning closer to look at it. Okay, so maybe Aunt Mary's advice was going to take some practice. She reached forward and lifted the little golden box. Phil stepped forward, just enough so that his arm touched my back. This is very nice. Is there anything in it? Then she actually shook it a little. My eyes widened and Phil's arm pushed it a bit on my back. Jonathan stepped up and she turned to him. Did you go and give Reina her coupling gift already? She chuckled, letting go of it so it clunked back against my chest. You know you're not supposed to do that, she laughed, and then patted Jonathan's chest. I looked up at Phil. He was frowning and looking at Elisa. Good. Now he was seeing what I was up against. Jonathan turned and looked at me. No, that's not her gift. I still have that hidden. He winked at me and I smiled. Well, good, she nodded firmly. I bet it's a wonderful present. You have such great taste, she said, as if she knew him and hadn't just met him the day before. Then she chuckled. I went to one coupling, and the girl actually gave her guy a keychain. She fanned herself and laughed. Can you imagine? My whole body went stiff. I took a step back and Phil moved in behind me. My back hit his chest. My own was rising and falling fast. Did she know? How could she know? My present to Jonathan was safely hidden in Paige's room, and she wouldn't tell, would she? That actually sounds like a nice gift. We all turned to Marcus, who shrugged. Something you would carry with you all the time. Done right, it could be a very nice token. Elisa blinked like was looking at a madman. Jonathan nodded. Us guys like our cars. Our keychains are kind of like a car accessory. He stated, and Phil nodded and pulled out his own. There was a small braided rope on his. It was green and white and faded. My little sister made this for me, he stated, and I lowered my eyes. She died when she was 7. She was always ill, and she made this for me so that I would remember to drive safely. He tucked it carefully back in his pocket, and I smiled up at him. Rosie was the sweetest girl. He grinned at me, and I thanked him with my eyes. He was sacrificing himself by telling that story and exposing something very dear to him, to stand up for me. He was a great alpha. Elisa's smile dropped. Oh, you poor thing, she whispered, and stepped right up to him. If I had tears, they would be falling right now. You must miss her so. My mouth started to drop open, but Jonathan's pressure closed it tight. Yes, I do. The whole pack does. Elisa nodded, as if she had not just made a total ass out of herself. Jackson walked over and pulled out his keys. My grandmother made me this, he stated, and held up his keys. There was a small wooden wolf carving dangling off it. I smiled. My pack was coming to my rescue. Did you lose your grandmother too? She asked, making her face look as sad as she could. He chuckled. Oh no, she's still alive, but she made this when I got my first car. Elisa nodded and smiled. I would like to meet her one day. Then she looked around at us as if she were addressing a class. I would like to meet all of your friends and family one day. Then she smiled at me. I have asked my mom and dad if I could stay here a little longer, after the party. I flinched and she grinned. I want to get to know my cousin and her friends before she goes off and gets unioned. She swatted Jonathan's arm. After that, I don't think any of us will be seeing them for a while. Elisa! Trent barked, and she rolled her eyes. Oh, please, Trent. Newly union couples always go away on some wonderful trip after the ceremony. Get your mind out of the gutter, will you? She turned back to me. Do you know where you will go yet? I don't, I stated quietly. Then remembered Aunt Mary's words, and I lowered my head a little. Jonathan stepped partially in front of me. We haven't even had the couple's ceremony, he stated firmly, and I held back my smile. Of course, she beamed. I just thought maybe you two had discussed where you might like to go. She looked at Phil. When I get unioned, I want to take a trip around the world. I want to see and do everything, all on the arm of my husband. She put her hands together in front of her chest. To explore the world together. Is there anything more romantic? You better hook up with a rich vampire then, Trent threw in, and all the other guys laughed, and Rock nodded. Very true. With the pack, we all chip in and send the new mates on a trip. But it's more like a nice week at the beach somewhere. Jackson nodded. Missy and Miles are getting mated soon, and we're working on a cruise for them. It's only 6 days and 5 nights, but they both love the water. And that's what counts, Phil stated from above and behind me. Elisa blinked. Yeah, she was off teeter now. Uh, oh, of course, she stuttered, and you could see her mind working overtime to recover. Wow, Aunt Mary was right. Back off, and she would make a total ass of herself all on her own. Okay, Aunt Mary didn't say ass, but that was the gist of it. I just mean, if money wasn't what mattered, I meant, she chuckled then, I'd like to chip in for the cruise, if I could. All of our eyes widened. What the heck? This was a pack thing. Thanks, Phil stated, but it's kind of a tradition that we all work for the money. We do fundraisers in Polson. Their closest friends work our tails off to raise the money. It kind of makes it from the heart, Track added, and the wolves nodded. Oh, she stated softly, looking down and waiting for someone to rescue her. But they didn't. Instead, Jackson walked up and smiled. Then we'll have to start on the trip for the two of you. My eyes widened and Alyssa chuckled. I'm sure Jonathan has that taken care of. She looked at Jonathan and he frowned at her. Reina is their pack. If this is what they do for new couples, I would feel honored that I would be considered as part of such a tradition. Rock smiled and softly punched at Jonathan's arm. Of course you are, man. Though there is a little initiation that you get to, have to, go through. Marcus laughed. Yeah, it's what all non-werewolf men are put through before they take on one of the females as their mates. Jonathan's eyes widened and so did mine. I didn't know anything about that. Phil smiled, still behind me. That's one thing we came to talk to you about. There isn't much time before this coupling ceremony. We talked it over and decided that we'll just have a pack chat for now and save the rest for after. I twisted my head and looked up at Phil. He smiled and kissed the top of my head. Not to worry, pup. We like him. We only rough up the ones we don't like. I swallowed hard and looked at Jonathan, but he was grinning and his chest was puffed up a little bit. He actually looked excited. Alyssa, however, was more than miffed that her spotlight was off her. Then you could almost see a light bulb go off in her head. Well then, Reina's girlfriends need to throw her a little due. She clapped her hands together, then looked at Phil. Unless the pack females do that too. He opened his mouth to talk, but she pounced. She put both her hands on his chest and looked up at him with pleading eyes. Oh, please, if they do, can I help? I'll do whatever's needed. I'm a great party planner. Phil swallowed and looked at me. I turned and looked at Track. Is there really a pack chat? I let my thoughts ask, even knowing Jonathan could hear me too. Track nodded, but he was not smiling. He was looking at Alyssa, who had her hands on our alpha without permission. Track was second in command, and I saw his jaw clenched. Is there a female version? I thought, and he shook his head. Not enough females for that. Then his eyes widened as he realized he said it out loud. I sighed, and Alyssa beamed. Oh, perfect! She smiled at me, but kept her hands where they were. I'll make it as small and perfect, just a few of her closest friends here at the manor. She looked back at him. I'll need to get a list of the females that should come, besides Melissa. Missy, we all said, and she nodded. Phil reached down, took her by the wrists, and gently moved her hands off his chest. She didn't even flinch. Oh, this'll be perfect! Then she gasped, and I flinched. We don't have much time, she looked around the room. Oh, I do hope you'll forgive me, but I better get to making plans. She smiled at Phil and Marcus. It was great meeting both of you, she sang, and then nearly bounced out of the room. I shot Track a stare that should have burned a hole through him. I'm sorry. I didn't think. I heard your question and I replied, and... Then he froze again. You heard her question? Phil repeated, and I lowered my head. Great. This was getting better all the time. I quickly spilled out all the information and then added, I told them not to say anything to anyone. I flinched under Phil's hard stare. Well, we weren't sure it would keep working. Maybe it was just a fluke. More stares, and I sighed. Okay, it has worked every time so far, but dang that whole pack thing. It was one thing not to let them know something, but I couldn't outright lie to my alpha. Jonathan stepped up. We thought, with all the security issues, that it might come in handy if something were to happen. Phil's eyes moved to Track. You should have told me. Track nodded and I shook my head. No, really, Phil, it's my fault. I asked him, both of them, not to tell anyone. Track was just keeping his word to me. Phil sighed and shook his head. Reina, I can understand not telling just anyone. This information shouldn't be known generally. But I'm your alpha. I'm responsible for you. Yep, tail between the legs and head down. I nodded and suddenly had the urge to nuzzle him and whimper softly. Luckily, in this form, I couldn't really do that. So instead, I moved up, faced him. Well, I was looking down. I did reach out and let the back of my hand brush his. I'm sorry, Phil. I shouldn't have asked them not to say anything. Another good thing about being on two legs is it would be kind of hard for him to bite the back of my neck and give me a few hard shakes. He didn't pull his hand away, though. That was a good sign. I rubbed mine against his again and waited. Then he turned. Trent, I hope we can expect that this information doesn't leave this group. My eyes widened. I had forgotten he was there. But I kept my head down, waiting for Phil to reprimand me. It's how this worked. It wasn't taught. It was instinct. Until he gave me some sign, I would stand here like this to show my submission, respect, and regret. I did notice Jonathan stiffen next to me. I hoped he wasn't too angry that I had to do this, but it was embedded in my DNA. Finally, Phil's hand turned and he took mine and gave it a soft squeeze. I let out my breath and looked up. He shook his head. What are we going to do with you? He said with a soft smile. I shrugged. Everyone seems to keep saying that. He chuckled then and pulled me into a hug. I flung my arms around his middle and relished the acceptance. I inhaled his scent and smiled, feeling a wave of happiness rush over me. That's where I'm going to stop there.